Hello everybody, this is Mr. McKeever again today, and today we're going to continue our exploration into colonialism or imperialism. But as we talked about last time, there's a lot of this imperialism. It's going to be a huge trend in European history now, from the age of exploration all the way up into the mid-20th century. And it's kind of broken into four different stages when we talk, at least in most historians' minds. First, you have the initial age of exploration, where the Spanish are really dominating the events, but you also have the Portuguese as well. Then we have the creation of mercantilist empires around the world, which you're going to see some new players be introduced into the game. Eventually, we see Phase 3, which is the imperialist empires in Africa and Asia during the mid to late 1800s. And then finally, the final period of imperialism, which is decolonization, which happens in the late 20th century. So today we're going to talk about what's happening in Stage 2. During this stage, we now have really four major players that exist in the world. The Spanish are still around. They're still going to control their colonies in the New World. But we're also going to see the introduction of the French, the British, and the Dutch during this period of time, each to varying levels of success. Now, why this is significant, because now we're going to have conflicts brewing between European nations over colonies that exist around the world, particularly between the British and the French, who have a long-seated hatred of each other, and that's not going to stop when it comes to exploring the various aspects of the world. But the major player during this stage of imperialism is going to be the Dutch. The Dutch are going to change the entire game and how this works, and that's really where we want to begin.
There are only two things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Dutch.
But nobody really hates the Dutch. Alright, so let's talk about the mindset and how all this works. This entire system, this entire level of imperialism, this age of exploration is built around the concept of mercantilism. It is the belief that the sole purpose of a colony is to benefit whatever mother country owns it. So if it was Great Britain is the mother country, and the United States is the colony, the sole purpose of the American colonies is to benefit Britain. Now, because European nations are so benevolent, and because they are looking out for the benefit of their colonists, they will do things to improve their lives, such as protect them from invaders, or protect them from native peoples, but their purpose is to benefit the people back home. And that is their sole and most important purpose. With that in mind, there are a few premises that you kind of need to have for this system to really make any sort of sense. One, the sole means of determining how great a nation is by its acquisition of wealth. A nation is only as good or as important as the amount of gold and silver that it has. And money is exclusively tied to your gold and silver. And that there's a finite amount of gold and silver in the world. So, these are not really premises that we really abide by today. We don't believe that gold and silver are the only way for people to attain wealth, and that wealth is the only measure of the usefulness of a country. But back then, these two ideas were how the world believed things, how the world kind of presented itself. Next, that colonies are only allowed to trade with their mother country. This would allow them to benefit that mother country exclusively. And that lastly, because colonies are so ingratiated and so loyal to their mother country, they'll like this system. They'll love it, they'll find it useful, and they want to live in this system. So with these basic premises, we can kind of understand at least a little bit more why the Europeans act the way they do, and why this system itself develops. But the reality is that it was kind of an illusion to begin with. Colonies do not necessarily like this system, and because of that, what we see during this early age of exploration, early age of mercantilism, is we see the development of smuggling. People don't want to be forced to have to trade with only one group of people. Modern economics tells us that the more competitors you have, the better the deal is. If you can buy something for $5 when other people are charging $10, you're going to choose the cheaper deal. The deal is most beneficial to you. So the colonies immediately are going to have an issue with this, and they're going to begin trading with other nations that they're not supposed to. And what we see is the golden age of smuggling or piracy. Pirates become a thing during this period, and they will trade everything from gold to silver to the most important commodity of this period, which is rum. That will come out of the Caribbean Ocean in the New World as a cheap commodity that people can buy to get drunk. This is where we start to see how this whole mercantilism thing is a little flawed. Colonies don't really like it. It is a problem, and it's eventually going to lead to its inevitable downfall. But that's part one of this story. Let's talk about changing locales, because that's a huge aspect of this new age of imperialism as well. Is we're not exclusively talking about the Americas anymore. We are now moving away from just North America and South America. Yes, they are important roles to this, but we're also going to look at Asia as well too. Because now India is going to become a huge piece of this. Now the Indies themselves are going to become a huge piece of this. After the initial efforts of the Portuguese, Vasco da Gama and Bartolomé Dias, we start to see Europeans become a lot more invested in the islands and coastal areas of Asia. Unfortunately for the Portuguese, they're just not that good at developing colonies that far away from their mother country. But luckily for other people, somebody's going to develop a system to do that. It's going to become through trial and error, though. The Spanish are going to try to find a way to get to that area of the world after the Portuguese, realizing that the trade routes that the Portuguese have are now pretty much exclusively owned by the Portuguese. They're going to say, hey, this whole Columbus idea of traveling west is not a bad idea, but he just needs to travel a little bit farther south. So they'll commission another guy by the name of Ferdinand Magellan to do that. So he will travel west from Spain, hopefully getting to the areas that now the Portuguese have in Southeast Asia. And they kind of vastly underestimate how, one, large the Americas are, and two, how really freakishly large the Pacific Ocean is. And eventually Magellan will travel around the world, but unfortunately he doesn't find what he's looking for in any sort of reasonable amount of time. It takes him a few years to travel around the world. He never actually makes it back. But he and his crew are the first group of people to circumnavigate the globe. But it doesn't really amount to much of anything for the Spanish. They aren't really able to develop any permanent colonies because the route Magellan takes to Asia is so long and so deadly that no self-respecting person will ever try to commission a business to be able to do that consistently. But someone else will come up with a better option. Spain gives up a fight, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be the Dutch. The Dutch are going to be the key to all of this because they're going to develop a system that really takes away a lot of the risk that the Spanish were really hesitant about after Magellan's exploration. They will create something called a joint stock company, the first of which is going to be the Dutch East India Company. And how this works is that individual investors will invest X amounts of dollars, and a bunch of people will make these investments so that if the company goes under, you only lose the amount of money that you invested into it. You're not stuck with having lost everything, which is what pretty much everyone had been doing up to this point. They'd been relying on a monarch to do this because only they could afford to lose that much money. Well, now with this Dutch invention of a joint stock company, the Dutch East India Company is going to be able to make exploratory movements into Southeast Asia. And when they do, they are going to pretty much kick the Portuguese out of Southeast Asia. They'll travel all around Africa and develop trading posts at Ceylon, which is what we call Sri Lanka today, and largely in places like Singapore and Indonesia, a place that they called back then the Dutch East Indies. And the Dutch become extraordinarily wealthy doing this. Their trade routes are very crisp. They are really successful. The system they develop is much more beneficial to the native peoples than that of the Spanish, or that of the Portuguese, or eventually the British and the French. And because of the good relations that the natives have with the Dutch, there's very little conflict on their trade routes, which means there's a lot less risk involved. And the Dutch become the dominant trading empire during this period.
It's actually, I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
It is. It's incredible and amazing. Well, we'll also see exploits that exist into Far East Asia as well. China and Japan are the gold standard of civilizations at this time in East Asia. And they're both going to have two very different experiences when it comes to dealing with Europeans. Chinese first real examples in dealing with Europeans during this period are actually going to come from Russian fur traders. Russia shares a border with China. Granted, it's a very, very, very far away border from where Moscow and the modern Russian nation is developing. But it'll at least introduce the Chinese to the Europeans. So when Portuguese traders and other people will come to China via sea routes later on, the Chinese already have their understanding of what they view Europeans as. And that is kind of like that little brother mentality where they're kind of cute, but at the same time, they're, for all intents and purposes, inferior to you. The Chinese civilization was more stable, wealthier, more advanced. It had everything that it needed and didn't really need the Europeans all that much. So because of this, the Chinese are really going to exclude Europe from mainland China and only allow them access to a small port off the city of Canton, which in hindsight was probably a poor decision even to limit them or to allow them anywhere near China at all, but that's a story for a different time. In Japan, we have a bit of a different story. The Japanese are first going to experience Europeans when Francis Xavier and various Jesuit missionaries come to Japan. But initially, the Japanese love Francis Xavier. The Jesuits are extraordinarily respectful of Japanese culture and Japanese propriety. They will do exactly what is asked of them in the Japanese royal court, and because of this, the Japanese will welcome Jesuits to Japan. And things actually start off quite well. It is eventually when non-Jesuit missionaries arrive in Japan that things turn very sour very quickly. Large portions of the population are converting to Christianity, which is a little unsettling to the Japanese leadership, but when they start proposing ideas that the Japanese shouldn't adhere to the fundamental belief that the emperor is kind of like a god king, things turn real sour real fast. The Japanese are going to kick Europeans out of Japan, and they're not going to be allowed back into the nation until the 1800s. Japan is going to completely cut itself off from the rest of the world, which is not great for European traders, one, and two, not really great for Japan because they're going to miss an entire age of human development when we talk about the scientific revolution and then eventually the industrial revolution. But due to some poorly executed missionary exploits in Japan, Japan is going to be no longer a trading option for Europeans for the foreseeable future. So we have kind of a mixed bag in how this next stage of imperialism is taking place. To recap what Europe and how its imperial exploits look at right now, what we have here is the Americas are pretty much dominated by the Spanish. The Dutch now have Southeast Asia, places like Ceylon and the Dutch East Indies. China is pretty much cut off from European exploits, except for a small city at Canton. The Japanese are completely off limits. Things are in a weird spot. But there's another area left to explore. The Spanish only control the central and southern portions of America. North America is going to become a new battleground for colonial exports. And also the massive market of India. And these two areas are going to be fought over by the French and the British. So let's talk about North America first. Initial exploration into North America by the British is going to allow them to gain control of Canada and the Ohio River Valley. These areas are extraordinarily useful when it comes to trade, but that's it. There's not a lot of wealth in North America. There's not a lot of gold and a lot of silver. For France, it's going to be the Mississippi River Valley tied to Louisiana. So farther south, the Midwest, places like St. Louis, directly tied to the Mississippi, are going to become French trading area. For the French, it's great for things like furs and stuff like that. Again, trading resources, trading commodities, but not gold and silver. But there's going to be a lot of conflicts between these two civilizations during this period in North America. Both of them have different stances on how to deal with Native Americans. At the time, the French are going to be much more hospitable to the Native Americans than the British will be. We're going to have a lot of issues as to who controls what area during this period, who has the ability to trade with whom. It's very hard to control trade in a new continent like this. So sometimes French traders will try to trade with the British if they can get better deals, even though that's against French law, and it gets to be really hazy. And also there's just situations as to what is the better civilization, the better people. And there's really no better example of this than what happens in Canada for the territory of Quebec versus the rest of Canada, where you have two very different views of society. In India, we have another situation occurring, also between the British and the French. Both nations build rival trading companies, both joint stock companies, in India during this period. And both of them are trying to feed off the fact that the Indian government, the Mughal Empire, is falling apart during this period. Whoever is going to become the dominant area or dominant trading company in the region is going to have access to the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that live on the Indian continent during this period. And there are tons of resources in India that both civilizations want. So these two areas are going to become consistent battlegrounds between the British and French. So, recap this one last time. The British and the French are going to battle over North America and India. The Spanish are going to have South America and Central America. The Dutch are going to have the East Indies. Now, not to just leave the Spanish out of this situation, there's also going to be a slight revision to how the Spanish dominate this area. They still have the largest colonial empire at this point, and they also now realize that the system that they have that controls it is kind of broken and needs to be fixed. So they're going to institute a new type of system, a top-down hierarchy, led by a man called a viceroy, who's going to control that territory. These viceroys are hand-selected by the monarch in Spain. They will also create a system of viceroys called an audiencia, judicial council, that will help determine legal matters in these colonies, because it takes too long to get input from Spain. And then also administrative councils appointed by them. These systems are supposed to streamline the government in these colonial areas and hopefully remove abuses by the leaders of these areas. But this is what we call a patronage system. A system that is designed on people getting their jobs based on either their familiarity or influence with the person who's deciding, and also if they pay for them. So unfortunately, a lot of these people, the viceroys or members of the administrative councils, are really ill-suited for the jobs that they're given. So this will lead to a lot of corruption and abuses, and unfortunately the native peoples in these areas are going to be the ones who suffer the most, because they're going to be exploited extraordinarily during the system. And this is really begging for some sort of reform that will eventually come in the Spanish colonies, but not yet. So, that is our big chunk of things from the course of this area in regards to colonialism round 2. The last thing I probably should mention before I close out of the video, I kind of glossed over that there. The Spanish are also going to control exclusively trade during this area, during this era of history. They believe that only the Spanish crown should profit from Spanish colonies, basic idea of mercantilism, and will institute a house of trade that is supposed to control all trade from the New World and to the New World. Unfortunately, it is extraordinarily vulnerable to corruption, and that's exactly what will happen in the future. Thanks, and you guys have a wonderful day.